everyone, and welcome to the Forward Thinking Podcast. It's Chrissy here from CS2. Today, I'm joined by our guest, Jessica Meyers. She's the Director of Marketing Ops and Technology at PatientPop, and today we're going to be talking about a topic that some of you might be going through. I'm sure if you clicked to listen, you probably are, but it's how Mops can successfully support a merger or an acquisition. Jessica is currently going through one of those right now. So we thought it would be a timely topic for her to share her experience and all of the tips and what you can do from an operations perspective, specifically on the Mops side. So thank you so much for joining, Jessica. Nice to have you on.
Thanks for having me, Chrissy. Excited to be here chatting about mergers, acquisitions. I'm, as you said, living one and excited to share that with the community.
Awesome. I feel like too, I don't know if it's a rite of passage or something for marketing ops folks, but if you go through one, I feel like a lot of people do, especially if you're in the startup space or B2B kind of tech. But I've definitely been through a few or have helped clients through them. So it's something that I think folks should definitely get kind of familiar with.
So prior to being in-house was...
All right. So, go ahead.
I was going to say, I was a consultant for a minute and helped a number of people on the consulting side. And now being in-house, it's a different experience, at least for me.
Yeah, I can imagine that for sure. It's probably a lot nicer coming in as the consultant than maybe be in the middle. I handled them on the in-house side too. So yeah. Okay, so before we get into the topic, I just want to go through what we always ask our guests, which is how they got into Mops. Everyone has like a different origin story. It's definitely something that you don't really study in school or anything. So could you give us just some background on how you got into Mops and to be a director today?
Yeah, I have what I feel like is a unique origin story, but I think most of us who've been in this space for a little while do as well. I started my career working for a really, really small startup where the entire point of the startup was to gift experiences instead of things. At that startup, I worked overseeing our experience provider partners, and through desperate technical need, got our developer to teach me SQL. And so 24-year-old me was learning database language and was ready to make a transition and really liked that technical aspect of my job, but wasn't necessarily sure I wanted to actually write code all day, every day, and really enjoyed the process aspect of my role and had been really recently working on a large API project. Found Mops as the possibility to do something relatively technical without maybe that needing to write code all of the time, and still really focus on process and things like that. Consulted for a while before joining a healthcare tech startup and have been there for just about 2 years now, overseeing the marketing technology practice.
Before you had the job where you learned SQL, like when you were in school or anything, did you learn anything? Did you study anything technical, or were you always kind of more on the technical side, or what's your background?
I was an art history and archaeology double major, and I have a minor in classics. So no is the short answer. Yeah, not at all. And worked in an art gallery for a little while. So the SQL thing was the hard pivot into, I think this is really interesting. I really like that logical flow and approach of information, but was not at all where undergraduate Jessica thought she was going with her life.
Yeah, I think that's like a common story that we see too. I think some people maybe had gone like a finance route, or maybe some folks didn't study anything related and maybe was a BDR for a while and enjoyed the process. Like everyone has like these different gateways to operations, and a lot of the time it doesn't translate. I mean, even Xander on my team was on last week and he wanted to be an actor, And actually it really helps him now as like a consultant. But everyone has like different paths that they took. But that's one of the things I love about Mops is it's it doesn't have this like direct linear path, and everyone typically has like different experiences that kind of add to their ability to what they bring to the job, which is fun to see. Okay, so just to kick it off, and we'll go into the topic, but maybe just to give a little bit of background, kind of, I know you're 2.5 years into your job right now, and you're currently going through, I think it's a acquisition, but maybe to give everyone some clarity around the project that you're working on. How did that start? When did you get involved? And then for people who are thinking about it, like what's like the first steps that you took, or maybe you suggest people should take in order to make the process as smooth as possible?
Yeah. So I'm in the middle of a large merger, actually, between two healthcare tech companies. The companies formally announced the merger in November. And it's an interesting project in that it is this merger, but also rebrand. So I work at PatientPop. We merged with a healthcare tech entity, Cario. And throughout the process of the merger, PatientPop and Cario are forming a new entire company, Tebra, that will essentially eventually be the parent entity, and the two existing brands will become products or child entities of the new company. So it is this merger, brand combination, rebrand, all in one, which is really interesting. As a consultant, I'd supported a number of more traditional acquisitions where a parent company comes in and says, hi, welcome to our product portfolio. Here's our way of doing things. Here is our sales force. Here's our Marketo. Have a nice time. And because this is this entire merger, we're not only combining technology, but we're also combining and rethinking our entire go-to-market and how we approach and all the business processes that we have, which is really unique, I think, and a really fun problem. I've been involved in the project for a pretty long time. I mentioned it rolled out in November. Day one or day two, early on in the project, there was obviously a handful of things to support announcements and all of that sort of initial excitement, but then started quickly with the first thing I did was a technology rationalization. So take inventory of all of the technology that fits in the marketing department, figure out satisfaction level, usage, the way people are operating, and then also like the less fun contract dates and renewals and all of that sort of thing to build a early roadmap for what I can accomplish in the short term, and then what's going to take a little bit more because it's a little bit more dependent on connected technologies.
When you were doing the like stock of your technology, like were you surprised by, well, first of all, how many of them you had to like go through, but also was there a lot of steps that you had to take as far as like meeting with people to decide like which technologies were going to stay, which ones was going to keep over the other? Like how did that process look once you had just like compiled all of that information together?
I think at first I was pleasantly surprised, at least by the amount of overlap that the two companies that I'm bringing together had, which obviously made certain things pretty straightforward. For example, both teams use the same direct mail vendor and the same landing page tool, and a couple of things like that, which made those really easy. Beyond that, it was definitely an involved and multi-step process. So started with landscape orientation, and then kind of made sure I understood key dependencies. So, what is integrated into the marketing automation platform or the CRM that maybe is dependent on the larger unifying of the tech stacks conversation that sits within marketing, but you can't merge your two marketing automation platforms until you have direction around at least a unified CRM. And so kind of taking stock of that landscape. And then started to converse with the various marketing leaders and stakeholders in terms of, tell me more about how you're utilizing this tool. Where does this tool fit in the overall funnel? And what are your approaches with this tool? And also, like, explain your level of satisfaction or any use cases that you've wanted to accomplish in a tool like this, but haven't had the ability to do so. And I think a lot of the teams that I got to chat with really felt like that was a beneficial part of the process, is explaining a little bit more about some of their use cases and tools and technologies.
Mm-hmm. Did you use any kind of like surveying or tools or anything like that to like capture all of that information, or is it pretty simple, like G sheets and took your notes together, or was there anything that helped facilitate that process?
I wish I had done a survey. That is a great idea and would highly recommend that for anyone moving forward. I did some G sheet work and started with that as the primary use case. And then we brought in a partner to help with the CRM conversation. You know, both companies are 500 employees and have a pretty large sales and CS workforce using the CRM. And so they helped also facilitate a lot of process rationalization, documentation conversations, especially on things that are connected into the CRM.
Yeah, I feel like that's kind of like how it usually starts, since there's so much that just is like the central place for obviously revenue information and where sales is, and all of your data usually, all of your tools are typically pointed towards your CRM. So find that that's like the biggest thing to tackle. And a lot of companies do bring in kind of like a external resource or expert to start, because it's just a behemoth of a project. And obviously folks like yourself who work internally still need to keep the lights on and everything running while still contributing to the project and looking forward. How was that process for you? Like, how much of your time was spent toward, or it still maybe is, but towards the merger? Then how are you able to then dedicate time to kind of just keeping the marketing, going and helping them stay focused on the current goals?
I think at this point, so we're about 8 months in to merger work, 7 months in, and the majority of my time is definitely spent not necessarily rationalizing, helping work towards aligned processes and aligned technology for the combined company. I'm really lucky in that I had been working on my 2022 roadmap when we announced the merger, but it wasn't formalized yet. And so then my high level 2022 roadmap became the merger. And so we had the ability to make sure that was the biggest priority from an operations and technology standpoint. Beyond that, I have a couple of team members who are definitely supporting our marketing team with kind of the business as usual type of stuff, from campaign operations, QA, et cetera. And they're still pretty focused on BAU, but everything they do, at least from a business as usual standpoint, has this lens of, is this how we want this to be in the new combined marketing process? So as I work through campaign deployments and helping our marketing managers stand up things, focus on, is this the most efficient way? Are there optimizations as we combine? And we're looking at a lot of our like BAU type of initiatives are short-term BAU. So we're not deploying a massive multi-channel nurture program at this point. We're looking at things that span, 3 to 5 months as the primary focus.
Yeah, but so that's kind of like where we are right now. When you first started, and when the first, the merge like essentially got announced, how did the teams kind of combine to start working with each other? Like, was there another ops team that then merged with your own and the resources were shared, or what did the marketing teams just quickly start working together, or were teams still working as separate functions for a while and still figuring out a way to then communicate and work together?
Some of all of the above. The two marketing orgs, when we combined, were actually surprisingly complementary in that one marketing org was a little heavier on demand gen type of initiatives, and one org was a little heavier on the corporate marketing, so brand, creative, and product marketing, which just worked out from a surprisingly complementary aspect. Because marketing is at the forefront of rolling out a new brand and new brand identity, the two orgs combined, I think, much sooner than many of the other teams in the greater org. And so pretty early rolled out a combined leadership structure across the two brands, where the goals were to start learning and engaging with your counterparts and really combining the two. I was unique in that there was no ops person in the org we merged with. They had open headcount that they'd had for a little while, but delayed hiring that headcount until after the merger to see where they would fit within the team I had already started to build and the skill sets of the team I already had. And so I got the opportunity to absorb that role and find the right person for what we needed. But was also tasked with the challenge of I do my own or my historically side systems and process really well. And I didn't have necessarily a counterpart filling the same role that I could lean on. So there was a lot of like, it's starting a new job, you know, when you maybe don't, you transition an ops manager out and somebody else comes in and you get to learn from what you can find and the documentation and things like that. So there was some of that.
Yeah. Oh man. I'm sure that just added like an extra layer, but I think, a lot of Mops pros are kind of used to that by now. Like you enter a new job and you're just picking up the pieces where you can, or trying to figure it out. So, or maybe even from your consulting work, you know, you have to try and get up to speed with the client really quickly. So I'm sure you have the reps to do that. As far as like the goal, so obviously it takes a lot of time to, and we'll go into kind of the tech stack and how you ended up approaching that, but it does take time to kind of, you know, actually get those aligned. So kind of how did you like foster like everyone to still kind of collaborate with each other or get the things that they needed done in the systems, like before there was a plan to kind of align them? Like how, and was there communicated like certain timelines that they would do it until you knew like there was a certain kind of like cutoff?
So I think in terms of fostering collaboration early on, we did and are still doing a lot of like knowledge share or process share kind of sessions with team members who've filled similar functions across the two orgs. And so, you know, walk me through how you run a webinar program from end to end, or walk me through what your lead to sales, inbound to sales funnel looks like, and what are the key milestones. I think those were always approached by all of our team members with the air of learning, but also identifying commonalities. And so seeing, hey, this is how they're doing it. That's really similar to how we're doing it here. You know, maybe we're saying one thing on a call, but it's really just a nomenclature difference. I think that was really, really helpful. Relatively early on, we definitely communicated to the team of, for the next couple of months, it's going to be not necessarily day by day, but a little bit of shifting and work in progress as we rationalize and figure out a long-term plan. And I think so much of the marketing team got to be involved in some of that. Explain to me how you're doing things, how you're using your tools and technologies, that they felt like they got brought along for a lot of that process, which really helped.
Yeah. I mean, you talked about like the tech or technology, and like when you look through the technology and saw a lot of similarities between the two, and that helped kind of decide maybe which to migrate or keep and so forth. But I think for me, I'm also thinking about, and this might be one for a lot of listeners, the hard part for them too is for each of the orgs, they probably have different ways that they, like you said, like the processes, but like certain things like, you know, your life cycle and the stages that they use and what your definitions are and how you even measure a report on that. And what were those kind of conversations like? And how do you get like the two? It's already hard getting one org to trying to get aligned on a life cycle, but how is that approach then for getting both of them to kind of combine and like agree to a certain kind of way of looking at the revenue team's performance?
It's a work in progress, if I'm being, totally honest. We're many months in, and it's still something that we're actively having conversations around. I think from what I've seen and kind of what I'm living is it fits one of two schools of thought. It's what you adapt to one way of doing it that already exists, and it's fully adapt to existing process of one team, or it's not start over, but decide what you want it to be for the combined company going forward. And we're doing more of that than what we previously did. And so more of reviewing any gaps or areas where neither team is able to report as effectively as they want right now, and talking about those and identifying kind of where we want to go for the future, at least from, a revenue management process. There's also, I think, some of the little things like one team reports on revenue annually and one team reports on monthly revenue. And so working a lot with the finance team and other core stakeholders on exactly how we want to define certain KPIs for the combined business.
As you're doing that, like, do you have like a certain team that you're just constantly working with and checking in on, kind of that has like a representative from each of those teams, or as things come up, do you just pull in the people that you need to? Like, how has that collaboration been facilitated?
Yeah, we worked through a pretty large RACI matrix across the combined company and across the two businesses that we're bringing together, and broke it down into like core workflows, because I think we talked about for many orgs, this is going to be centered around your CRM. We broke it down into a couple of like core CRM workflows and identified, like the tech owner for that workflow, and then business process owner, and then various folks who support the business processes who also need to be, informed or consulted. And it's a pretty beefy RACI. And that I think really helps make sure that the appropriate stakeholders are involved in the conversation. But you also have to delegate. I think that's one thing is you have to find and trust the business and technology representatives that you bring to that table to understand the end-to-end process and speak effectively to their core areas.
Yeah. And that could be, and because that could be, setting yourself up for disaster if you try and like handle that yourself. And I think when you're taking into account kind of you need those team skin in the game. One thing I've seen before too is like, let's say like a sales representative or SDR leader or something like isn't really involved. Like it just, trying to get that team to adopt later, or even understanding the team is going to be so much harder, especially now that you have two teams that are then merging together and like what's going to make sense for them. But getting the feedback and facilitating like the needs and the wants from those stakeholders, even if you're not going to like implement all of it, but having them understand and be a big part of that process, I think just has them be that like extra like champion for you, and also give you the feedback that you really need anyway to like architect something that's really going to be adopted. And for those teams, it's especially important because so much of that process and data capture on the sales side and merging those, making sure it's all effective, is one of the hardest parts. I think, at least, it takes a lot of collaboration. And so
yeah, I think it's a really interesting balance of making sure that everyone is brought along for the journey, because I very much agree with you that you want them to have the opportunity to voice, hey, here's what I really love about our current process. Here's what I find really easy about our lead management or our, person record management. Here's where I spend too much time in my day. I think that's really, really important. But it also, there's a balance in making sure that the feedback and the way you're structuring things is also forward looking, if that makes sense.
Yeah. No, I think that does make sense, because you can have like unproductive conversations then at that point too, when you're making all of your kind of feedback based on what's happened in the past, and it's like, well, we're not there anymore, we're trying to look forward, and then it becomes like counterproductive, I think.
Yeah, I think there's a really good amount of historical context that should be transferred, but also a lot of focus around, well, what do I want it to look like? If I was, what is my ideal workflow or my ideal process, or that sort of thing.
Yeah. The benefit to the technology side, and we're actually, it's top of mind too, like with some of our clients, we'll do tech auditing. And I think right now, for folks who maybe have their budgets being a bit more scrutinized, they're also looking at like, how do I assess their technology and decide like what tools to keep and stuff like that? Like how I know you talked about a little bit at the beginning, but was there any kind of specific criteria also that you looked at for like what tools or platforms to keep, and maybe even setting priority for which ones do you even tackle, like for now until the future? Like how did you like set those priorities or also criteria for the technology to keep?
Priority was in some part dictated by contracting dates. I think you have a little bit of a hard deadline on a handful of things, and at least by that hard deadline, you have to know how you're choosing, or have an idea of how you're choosing to proceed. And so that was definitely one of the first things we took into account from a prioritization standpoint. I also made a pretty long, went through the understanding of what could I even merge when we were in multiple marketing automation and CRMs, because we're still very much in that space right now. And unsurprisingly, I think the list is pretty short in terms of what you can tackle when you're in two marketing automation tools. A lot of those integrations are deep, and the level of complexity to potentially connect something to two systems that it might be able to often outweighs the return on investment when you learn that when you realize that one of those systems is going away in a year, or 2 years or something like that. So you say, all right, to go through the work to combine this tool into this other marketing automation platform, I would need to invest from a team standpoint this many man hours, and what does that look like? I think was a big aspect of that. So level of complexity, level of integration, I think weighed heavily. Budget, team satisfaction was another one we took strongly into account. We had one or two tools that we were able to combine sooner. Due to our use case, they could actually point to two marketing automation platforms. And there were a handful where team sentiment was really strong in favor on one side and less strong in favor on the other. And that, I think, was something we factored heavily into decisions around which tool.
Mm-hmm.
We also, for anything that we approached combining, made sure we understood what the needs and uses were, and that whatever tool we were selecting even would solve all of those needs and uses. And so we weren't willing to sacrifice functionality on anything that we combined.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that all of those I think are really good cases. Like even if you're not like doing it from a merging standpoint, but like I think just going back and looking at your technology, I think assessing them with your team often too, because I think you'll get to points where like you look back and we're like, oh, why are we using this? And like no one's really has a good answer or even can say what material value they're getting out. Or then you see, okay, it stops meeting someone's needs. And then what happens is that then they just go and try and find a new tool. And then you're stuck with like two tools. So for everyone who's not, is actually just dealing with that just internally, that like going and having those constant reviews and documentation of your tech stack, and even trying to kind of do those rough estimates, like what Jessica is saying, like around like the hours it takes to maybe make a change, but also maybe even to maintain too, or trying to calculate an ROI on a tool too is a nice thing to do, and you can actually see it sometimes is you see great performance, like maybe you didn't even realize, but you're like, oh, this tool is actually impacting like every deal because the reps are using it or whatnot, and so you can see some of that.
Yeah, we looked a lot, like more qualitatively at business disruption level too on things.
Yeah.
I think our sales engagement tool is a great example. So like sales loft outreach, things like that.
Yeah.
Not necessarily 100% in my purview, but definitely something from a connected technology standpoint that marketing plays a hand in. But we have a couple hundred sales reps or across the two businesses at the very least. And the level of disruption something like that faces is not insignificant. And so that was definitely also something we kind of put in the stack rank is what is the level of disruption in making a change at this point, and how much might that impact revenue if you're taking a tool offline for teams, wanting to make sure that's really, really dialed.
Yeah, that downtime too, or like just getting the sales team trained on a new tool is like, I think something that companies like don't quantify as much as it actually is, especially for sales tools like sales engagement platforms. It's amazing. Like we see a lot of companies flip flop and even sometimes make the decision based on like a sales person, a leader that comes in. That's not the right direction to go. There's other criteria you should be selecting for if it makes sense to use. But yeah, that disruption I think is sometimes like not really like, I think unless you're in Mops or unless you're in Ops and you really see the impact like, and think about you're used to looking at your end users and what it takes for them to adopt technology, then I think it's not something that people really take as heavy as they should. I think for one thing that strikes me for the next thing I want to ask is, and this is probably the hardest thing I think for some mergers or acquisitions, is really just around like merging data sets together and any tools or strategies that you have. It's pretty much, I think, one of the hardest parts, but do you have any tips or strategies that you've learned throughout this process for how to potentially approach that the right way? Any learning lessons too?
Oh, it is such a challenge. I empathize with anyone who's going through a merger because it's definitely been a long process. For example, we've been working on identifying what we would define as a joint customer between our two businesses. And we happen to work in the medical space, which has some unique uniqueness to it in that a medical provider may work for multiple practices. And so they may be a joint customer with one practice, but not the other, and things of that nature that present interesting challenges. And that's been a long process. From a way we're approaching it standpoint, we are doing, at least to start, some one side of the house and the other side of the house internal cleanup first. So I think duplicates is our first approach, and each team is undergoing an internal multi-step deduplication process and definition where we clean up our house before we invite the guests over, so to speak, and work through that. And we're sharing learnings and best practices, and the teams involved in building those duplicate rules are shared because we're going to be leveraging the same duplicate rules across both sides of the business. That's the first step we've looked at. We're evaluating a handful of iPaaS or integration provider as a service tools to help combine the two, and have undergone a pretty thorough evaluation there to help actually do all of that connection work. And that's been a fun process to be a part of as well.
Yeah. When you think about like the data, because you talked about customer, is there like a certain kind of priority also that you all focused on? So from like a like definition of like the customer, or how, like you mentioned, how to report on revenue and look at it the right way, but was there like, did you start from like top level and then working your way down as far as in terms of getting everyone kind of in the same like data dictionary or thinking about things the same way? Or how is that like prioritization? Or is it also just where like different teams are focused in different areas depending on their purview, and then they come together to the group to define that?
So we are working through, I think there was definitely some prioritization in terms of core priorities. And I think you raised a point that I've talked about a number of times internally. How we define certain things may impact how we choose to merge or handle the data. That I think there's a lot of downstream impacts. At this point of where we're at, we're still really focused on getting the house in order. And so doing a lot of the making sure that data on each side of the house is clean and ready to be merged. And that prep work, I think, while maybe a little less glamorous than the actual stack ranking of, what's our set of pick list values for this pick list, for example, where the two might be very, very different, is a little less fun. It's, I think, really foundational work to ensure that we're building on something clean, and reconciling across two pick lists that have 20 or 50 values is significantly easier than reconciling across pick lists that maybe had gotten out of control. And so that's kind of the focus of where we're at right now, is getting the data ready to do the big merge between the two.
Yeah. I love the idea of kind of like cleaning up house. Like, I think that's a great takeaway for everyone, is like clean the house before you invite people over. I love that saying. I think that's a really good one. I think, like you said, like starting with duplicates. I think also like if like just figuring out like what's not actually being used, if that hasn't been like documented, and using tools like a field trip or something like that to see like what's actually populated on these records first, and then going through that with everyone. I think that's a really good thing to do. And for folks listening, it's good to do whether you're going through a merger acquisition or not. Like, maintain the house. It's actually a good thing. Bring in the cleaner more than once a year.
We've done a lot of work too of terminology alignment. So when one team says lead source, what does that mean? Does the other team use the same word, same vernacular? Do they use the same field? At least from a marketing funnel management perspective, we've definitely done some exercises on that front, which I think in hindsight, I actually wish I had done immediately. I waited a little bit longer than I should have. And I think there were conversations that we went into where somebody was saying a word that's also a thing. And there were a lot of, when you say lead, do you mean capital L lead or do you mean person? And I think the entire marketing team at Tebra, that's our combined company, is sick of me saying capital L lead, capital C contact for the specific thing in Salesforce. But you don't necessarily recognize your own vernacular when it comes to tools and technology that may be really impacting somebody else's ability to understand what you're saying. And that I think is a big takeaway for myself, that if I go through this again, I'm gonna make like a vocabulary guide for both teams of when I say this, I mean this, or that sort of thing. But when I say lead, I don't necessarily mean only lead. I mean person, and trying to pay attention to my own terminology usage and try and use agnostic words when I'm talking about agnostic business processes.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think one thing too is like it kind of even just happens in our space, like in general, but people say like attribution. It's like, well, what kind of attribution are you talking about? Are you talking about like simple, like source level attribution? Or are you talking about multi-touch attribution? All that kind of stuff. So I love that idea of like having a dictionary or even like a data kind of guide. Like when we say this, it means this. I think companies like could just value from that just for sales and marketing talking to each other, or like a CSM team then coming to that team. So it's like a revenue team cheat sheet or something. It'd be useful.
I've definitely, as we've gotten more in the weeds on the process, started to call myself out and say, hey, when I'm saying this, or when I hear you say that, this is what I'm hearing. Is that correct? To stakeholders I'm talking to. And I think that's been really beneficial. And because there's definitely been a couple of times where I was hearing one thing and then I asked my question and they were like, oh no, that's not what I mean. I actually mean this. And I'm very glad that I didn't solution based on what I was internalizing based on my own history and ask the stakeholder to clarify for me. Yeah,
that's a really good point. I think that's a challenge that people probably would go into. I think we only have like a minute left, but the last thing I want to end with is, you can answer this whether it's like more challenges that folks might need to plan for, or even like what you maybe even are like things that people do wrong. It's hard to say because you're going through this now, but like, what do you think are some challenges or things that you could actually plan for or prevent a challenge from happening that you don't typically plan for?
I think there is this with a merger specifically or an acquisition, there's often this chicken and egg, tech versus strategy. It's hard to do one without having the other there. That is really tough to solve for, right? You want to have a combined strategy, but when you're operating in disparate pieces of technology, that's hard to plan for. And then you want to have combined technology, but both teams have different strategies, or multiple teams have different strategies or processes. And I think what I would plan for, don't let one dictate the other, and really think about the two connected. It's an opportunity to revamp, and I think make sure that you're not you can make progress on both at the same time. It just takes balancing the needs of both at the same time.
Yeah. Do you feel like more often than not that you would see that the companies would try and then come together to compromise or define a strategy and then decide on the technology. I know you're saying don't try and force one over the other, but if it was a tricky one for folks, like where do you think they should start first? More the strategy side?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, very much so. I think that marketing tech specifically, there's so much great marketing tech out there. And I think that's a reason why a lot of people, to kind of some of our points around, a lot of this is beneficial, even if you aren't going through a merger, maybe you have too much tech or things like that. There's so much great and really awesome technology out there. But all technology is only going to be as powerful as the like process and strategy that's driving it. Mm-hmm. And so I think having an understanding of the capabilities of your technology is really important from a strategy standpoint, but more so understanding the strategy, the business process, and those sorts of things will help you select and shape the technology to support versus getting hampered into or stuck in strategy because that's the technology that you have.
Right. Yeah.
Definitely strategy first if you have to pick one, but I think there's the opportunity to work on the two together for sure. Yeah,
for sure. Awesome. Well, I think that, kudos to you going through this big project. It's so much work, and it sounds like have been taking all the steps I think are probably super successful. So I hope everyone enjoyed all of the learnings that you're able to bring us today. We'll have to do like a check-in, like after we get things like merged and see how things went and share additional learnings. But thanks so much for being on the podcast, Jessica.
All right, this time next year we'll be fully merged and we can talk.
Where can people find more of you or learn more from you? What should they check out? Your LinkedIn or anywhere else?
I think my LinkedIn's a great place to stay connected and learn more from what I'm learning going through this big merger.
Awesome. Well, we'll link out to Jessica's LinkedIn profile, so definitely go follow her there. And if you enjoyed this episode of the Forward Thinking podcast, feel free to share it with your colleagues or friends or leave a review. We really appreciate it. And we'll see you next time on Forward Thinking. Have a good one.